Welcome everyone to this mini summit about road mapping. And road mapping is quite hard because everything changes all the time. You know, it can be external reasons, it can be internal things, and how to handle all that change in the road mapping is what we're going to talk about today. So basically what you risk is to end up with like a map versus reality problem, and you want to avoid that. And that means that your roadmap needs to be very adaptable to all this change which is going on, external and internal. And the best way to do that is to have a very collaborative approach. So as with everything else in Favro, it's about collaborative planning. Also, an important thing is to have everyone involved in the roadmap, so you don't end up with that people think one thing and the map says something else. The map in this case being, that roadmap. So the collaborative planning approach works really well because it both makes you capture the change, but it also makes people involved. So you have a chance of being way more successful if you do it that way. Now, what we're going to talk about today is road mapping, very much from, let's say, a publishing point of view with game development, where you have a portfolio of games. But the truth is that many studios today need to have the same perspective, because with most games being live games, that kind of portfolio perspective is something that many studios needs to do as well, especially if you're self-publishing. And there's also a need for road mapping, which is more like, let's say, scenario planning, where you need to create this kind of budget up front, and then you will kind of get into actually doing things. And those kind of things, basically, scenario planning, project budgeting, we will address in another mini summit. But if that's what you wanted, don't log off, because the key, if you do that, is then to connect these things, to connect that budget, to connect that as upfront scenario with your actual roadmap, and and how these things are working together. So with that being said, around why this is so important, I'm going to hand over to Jon. I'm going to look at some very concrete examples of how this is done in practice.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Patrick. For those of you who don't know him, that was Patric Palm, one of the founders and CEO of Favro, and I'm Jon Leslie, again, agile coach at Broad Cove Insights, also a Favro agile partner. So I'm going to be showing you quite a few things in the next 20 minutes or so. First, I'm going to be showing you a publishing portfolio example across multiple game studios, multiple games. And then I'm going to dive into more road mapping at the studio level itself, moving from there onto capacity planning at all different levels of the studio. And then finally, I'm going to show you kind of maybe a more modern and execution level way to handle capacity with a very complex level pipeline example, and using WIP limits to act as actually capacity, handling capacity on the fly in a flow-based way. So I'm going to start here, as I said, in this publishing example. This is based on a real-world example with that we're working on with an actual publisher across multiple studios. This is a simplified version, of course, and just keep in mind that because the boards in Favro can exist in multiple places, what I'm really showing you here is kind of a dashboard collection where we're seeing the publishing portfolio, maybe a couple of studio level production boards for all of their games in flight, and then also a team level collection. So just keep in mind that everything you see here is actually in other collections more focused to that level. So here's what the studio would see, and here is what the actual game team is seeing, maybe just their backlog and their current sprint board, something like that. But up here at the publishing portfolio level, they can see as much or as little of that detail as they choose in what's called the dashboard collection in Favro. So the way this works is they would have a publishing portfolio backlog over here on the left in this expandable and collapsible pane over here. They can see at a glance across all their studios, all their games, the current phase gate status of each one of those games. As you can see here, they can see very specifically statuses even across multiple teams and multiple levels by looking in more detail at the relations column, as you see here. So the way this works, you have a new game that enters into your publishing portfolio Kanban like this. You can see via relations that it's at selected. As this flows through to green light, right, that's automatically changing back here in the backlog too, keeping things in sync. Now, maybe they pass through green light. This gets pulled into pre-production. What studio's actually going to be developing this particular title, say Studio A. Now, as soon as I did that, it automatically added that card representing this game title to Studio A's production board at the studio level. Okay, so the cards in Favro can exist in multiple places at the same time, tied together by these relations. And you can see the status across all levels directly at the top of the card representing each game like this. And you have the ability to drill down into those levels of detail at will. So we're going to look at, moving forward, we're going to look at this game 3, which is currently in pre-production. We'll take this down to the team level so I can show you how not only can you drive things from the top down, from publishing down to the studio, down to the team, as we just did there, but also track progress from the team level up. So as the team is executing, it can actually be controlling the flow and aggregate on this high level publishing board and each studio's portfolio board as well. So here you can see that game 3 is also in pre-production for Studio A. You see it in aggregate across the multiple studios here for the portfolio. Now, game 3 has been broken down, which is very simple to do. The studio leadership probably did this, broke this down to its own board or backlog, right? So this was broken down to a backlog. It's now connected to this card representing that game production. You can tell that by the little paperclip icon here. Here is that backlog tied back up to both the studio level and the publishing level. If I'm looking at this from the studio's perspective, again, they just see this. They see what the games that are in flight at their particular studio. They'd also see the backlogs for the games, maybe over here on the left. And then the team is only going to see this. So they'd see that pre-production backlog and maybe the current sprint or multiple sprints. This could be, of course, across multiple teams as well. So the point being, and just for the sake of example, I'm going to feed all of these pre-production deliverables to this team, to this single sprint. And as things progress, again, of course, this would obviously be across multiple teams over much longer than a sprint. But as things progress, you can see that this progress automatically updated the status to in progress at the pre-production level. And that carries through all the way up to the portfolio level. These will all do the same. Eventually, these are all going to move to done or completed across those teams of teams. Now, as soon as pre-production is rolled up and flagged as done, up here at the studio level, it automatically moved this from pre-production to done here on their production board. And then up at the portfolio level, did the same thing. So game 3 moved from pre-production to production in aggregate up here on this portfolio publishing Kanban. Now this can also act as a roadmap, since the boards can be switched between different views of the same cards. So as I'm looking at this from a stage gate type of Kanban flow, I can switch it on the fly to a roadmap view and see for all these games that are currently in flight, possibly across a dozen or more studios, I can see their start and end dates from a production standpoint. I can also see for each game various milestones, so on and so forth, all on a timeline. And these dates, can be adjusted as well from what's happening at the lower levels. So that is a very high level roadmap, right, at the publishing portfolio level. Now I'm going to move to road mapping at an individual game studio. So game studios should be thinking about roadmaps on 3 levels. So the studio vision, the overall studio vision, which could look like this at a studio level roadmap, where they have not only the games that they currently have in production, but maybe new IPs that are in a discovery phase or a pre-production phase. Overall studio initiatives, like we want to achieve studio-wide agility. We want to become a more agile, transparent studio, for example. Major milestones, all of that at a very high level strategic roadmap for the studio itself. Now, these can be linked down and connected or broken down to these individual productions. So for example, Shadow Recon could be, you could drill down into this and see the Shadow Recon roadmap specifically. But before I get to that, the next level that a studio should be thinking at, if they have games that have achieved success to the point where they become a franchise, you want to start building out these franchise roadmaps. So maybe we started with Shadow Recon, that became a hit enough to warrant a sequel, and planning out multiple sequels into the future. As with most franchises, those sequels are staggered development across probably multiple studios out into the future. Visualizing that all on a single franchise roadmap like this, with again connections down to those individual production teams directly on the card itself. So I could drill down, for example, into Shadow Recon's master roadmap specific to this game. And I could see that from a producer standpoint, a studio dashboard standpoint, or roadmaps where it currently exists. So drilling down to that master roadmap for this specific title, Shadow Recon, could look something like this. First playable, move to an MVP, minimum lovable game, that whole concept. Maybe this is our early access target date, then it moves into live ops. You could break this down. These could then be connected to a feature roadmap, which is the next level. So the feature roadmap specific to this game might look something like this. So we get to either the feature areas mapped out over time or the specific features themselves. You can see that you also have the ability to show visual dependencies between those various features or feature areas like this. It's very easy to add a new one. Just simply click the card, say add dependency, before or after, and add it like that. This is all very easy to adjust and actually can be adjusted on the fly from what's happening beneath, just by clicking and dragging like this or through automations. Now, if a new feature, for example, needs to go on this roadmap, just to show you how easy it is to update these things with new content drops, new features. It's as easy as maybe taking merge with shadows, dragging and dropping that from the backlog and putting it on the roadmap like this. And now that card exists both in the backlog and also here on this roadmap. So there's a road mapping at 3 levels, primary levels of the studio, at each studio. Now I'm going to move into capacity planning for a studio. So capacity planning can happen in Favro, again, on multiple time boxes and be viewed in multiple ways. So here on these capacity planning boards, I'll start simple with a single team for a single sprint. And you can see maybe these are the members of that team. And up here at the top of each one of their columns, this represents their capacity limit for this particular sprint. So I can see that Jon here has a 42, he's limited to 42 hours of available capacity in this sprint. Now to set this up, you can tie any custom field, capacity field, estimate field, to this board. And since this one's in hours, we're automatically going to be setting the limit here for Jon in hours as well. So you can see maybe he's half dedicated to this 2-week sprint, so 42 hours. And he could be half, maybe the other 38 hours dedicated to another sprint on another capacity board. To quickly set this up for the entire team, you want to come here to limits. You can enter in the capacity for each person on that team, automatically rolls up to the total capacity for the entire team for that sprint. You can override that if you choose to, that total. You can enforce the limits for each person, meaning you couldn't even maybe add another task or feature to that person's list. Otherwise, it's just going to turn the columns red, indicating that they've exceeded their capacity, which I'll show you in a second. That all rolls up here. So everybody's green. Now, what would happen if via a sprint, Jon was maybe assigned in a sprint, and I brought on a sprint level board here for the sake of example, was assigned a new feature, merge with the shadows, and we'll give this to Jon and say that's estimated 21 points. When you break it down into tasks, you say, okay, this is actually going to take 42 hours. And now as soon as I assign that to Jon, it automatically added it to his capacity column up here on this capacity planning board. And you can see that he is now, with that new feature being added, merge in the shadows, he has now exceeded his available capacity for this sprint. 67 hours allocated. He only has 42 hours of capacity. It turns us red. Here at the top, since one person is now over allocated, it doesn't turn the overall board red, but yellow, indicating that at least one person is over allocated. As soon as all of these people were maybe over allocated, or you've exceeded the total for the team, maybe even by an individual, then it will also turn the total capacity indicator, scope versus capacity indicator for the team up here red at the top like this, which can be seen obviously even when the boards are collapsed. So this can be viewed in multiple ways. You could view this, what's the team capacity or your entire studio capacity even for each release. You can see these numbers are much higher because it's for a total release. Same thing as something is tagged to a release in a person, that will automatically show here, continuously calculating this. These can also be viewed in a timeline view. So if you want to see over time, broken down by person, who's maybe over under allocated at specific time periods, you can see that here. And you could also maybe slice and dice this, and this gets more into the scenario planning event that Patrick was talking about, by discipline, even ahead of time. So if it's assigned to somebody who's part of design or a group, it can automatically show up in design. You can see how much capacity we have from a design perspective, compare that to the scope of work, UI, UX, engineering, art, so on and so forth. So multiple ways to slice and dice and view capacity and plan capacity across your entire studio. Now, the last thing I want to show you is the actual at the execution level. I'm going to show you from a level team's perspective how that could look, and maybe a more modern way of handling capacity, which is WIP limits, and making sure that you're not overwhelming the flow. So here we have, in this example, we have a levels backlog. This levels backlog is feeding this multi-phase simultaneous levels pipeline. Starts in concept, maybe there's some concept and first look happening simultaneously, maybe some first look and functional phase happening simultaneously for each one of these levels as well, all the way through to presentable and actually ready for in-game, maybe final. As is often the case when you're working with levels, they're so complex, they involve multiple disciplines, multiple teams other than the level or world building team. So at multiple phases, as it reaches certain phases, you'll see how it actually includes that same card on story art teams board or VFX teams board, audio towards the end when it gets to functional and presentable, pulling in those other teams from their own collections, as you see here, into this level collection process in an ad hoc, just in time type of way of working, very flow-based way of working. So for example, I'll open up these two boards over on the right. So this is a high level levels phase tracker, for example, where you can see at a glance for all of our levels, exactly, number one, what phase each one of them is at. And within that phase, what step or specific stage are they at? So I can see Old Tristram Road is currently in first look, but more specifically, it's at blackout. Old Ruins is in functional phase, and it's specifically at rough lighting from a step perspective. So that's the high level. And if I were to commit a new level out of the backlog to this flow-based, this first flow concept, this first phase, you can see it automatically added it here to the overall aggregate phase tracker, to the big picture. And it's also changed the step and the phase back in the backlog too. So it keeps everything in sync automatically. Now, if I expand this out to see relations, you can also see very specifically all the different teams that are involved and where it's at from each team's perspective. So a one-stop shop to actually see the overall progress across teams of teams, even of all your levels. So as this flows through to the various stages, for example, once maybe it gets to PEX or PEX review, you now need to involve, before it can get out of concept, you need something from the story art team. So number one, when I drag this in there, it automatically used what's called a card template. And it said, for this particular concept phase, we're going to automatically flesh out on the card for you for each level that comes in, what should happen specifically at each phase in this table at the top, and various sign-offs and checklists related specifically to this phase. Now that happened automatically. And when it get to this particular stage in the concept flow, it automatically added this same card representing this level to the story art team's board in their own collection, saying we need something from you guys, right? So if we look at it from their perspective, and again, this would primarily exist in their collection, but for the sake of example, I brought it in here to this level pipeline collection. They're going to be looking at this and then they're going to see a new level pop in, and it's going to say specifically what's required from them for this level to proceed, right? Something that's needed soon before it can finish that concept phase. They need this beat board, okay? And they're going to go through their flow of the same card. Whereas here back in the backlog, you're able to see everything. You can say, okay, it's the concept phase, it's at PEX review, and the story art team is currently working on that beat board, all from a single location. So now this is going to go through to that experience doc, through to the final review and approval stage of the concept phase. And we have these custom approval or review steps built in. So as soon as who is ever responsible for doing this review, right, at the end of the concept phase, is going to be able to quickly come in and say this is either not approved or approved. If they flag it as approved, a bunch of things happen. It automatically moves this, takes it out of the concept phase, automatically moves this level to the first look phase, to the first step, which is blackout. Also automatically move that on the aggregate phase tracker at the top. So it looks like this now. It's been moved out of concept. Up here, it automatically moved to first look to that first step blackout. And down here, it's also been added to this first look board where it could start going through this flow. So on and so forth. Now we have another review. Let's say this gets approved. It moves it to the next phase, which is functional. If I turn on relations here on the card, I can see that when it gets to rough lighting, now another team needs to get involved, right? So now VFX needs to do something specific to this level at the functional phase once it gets to the rough lighting phase. So giving them enough time in advance to get done what they need to do for this level to complete this functional phase. So if I go down to the VFX team, they're going to see, just like that story art team, they're going to see the card pop into their flow. And it's going to very specifically say, what's the requirement for this level for our perspective? We need placeholder ambient VFX. So you can see how you're automatically involving multiple teams on an ad hoc, just-in-time basis, very flow-based way of working. So here, from a capacity planning standpoint, you can simply build in these WIP limits into each one of the columns. So say, for example, a new level comes in, where you get multiple levels into a phase like this. Instead of controlling it based on hours or days based capacity, you're actually just controlling the flow, saying, okay, we only have maybe 3 people at a time who can even create these experience docs or do this rough out or do this block out. And we're either going to visually call out that you've exceeded that inline capacity, that flow-based capacity, or we're going to deny it and make it so you can't even pull in a new card. That whole idea of focusing and finishing instead of starting a lot of things until another one has moved out to the next phase, thus freeing out that real-time capacity for that team, again, in a very flow-based way. So there you have it. We've gone through publishing portfolio example, road mapping at all 3 levels of the studio, capacity planning, and simultaneous, very complex, multi-level levels pipeline. So back to you, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Jon. And if you have any questions about this whatsoever, just ping our team, in the chat, in the tool, or on our website. Our team, they have experience with not only the technical side of things, but also best practices, agile best practices, or game development examples. And Jon is a former producer, and we can connect you with him as well. So try us out, ping us.
We do have one question that just came in.
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
Is there any way to see the automation rules you have for all those triggers going from one board to another?
That's a good one to show live, right?
Yeah, I can show you that. So quite a few automations tied into this particular example. So if I open up automations specific to this board, the automations are tied to each board and what happens on those boards. You can see, for example, that when I said concept was approved, it automatically moved the same card that was just approved from concept to first look to that first stage of concept. And this is the movement where it automatically changes it on that overall level phase tracker to the status from concept again to first look. So that's just one simple example of what an automation can look like in Favro. And when you're going through this, when you're first starting out in this automations gallery, there's a bunch of pre-built ones for you to start with. And once you get more used to it, you can create your own custom automations through this interface.
What I think is important to call out here is that the way automations work is that we put it in the hands of the teams themselves. So automations in Favro is not some central IT thing. It's something that you can do yourself in your teams. So every team can automate their own workflows. So whatever you want to automate, you can do it yourself. Right, cool. By the way, automations is a really good thing to ask our team about, because there can be a good conversation around how to fix certain things, what should be automated, what should not be automated, etc. With that said, thank you so much, and hope to see you in the next mini summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.